A company too small to look threatening entered a British Ministry of Defence competition surrounded by much larger manufacturers. The prize was the replacement of a legacy system from another era. In 1985, against the most obvious expectation, the team from Portsmouth won the L96A1 contract. Mastery is the word often used to sell this story. But the more interesting fact is that winning the competition proved no mastery at all. It merely opened the question, how did a design born among competition shooters become a family adopted by forces in several countries, survive a production crisis, and remain relevant decades later? The answer does not lie in a combat scene or a spectacular shot. It lies in a far less cinematic chain: requirement, architecture, manufacturing, quality control, environmental adaptation, and support. This is a story of engineering and military procurement, not an operational guide. The first link in that chain was an old problem. In the early 1980s, the British Army still relied on the L42A1, a solution rooted in the Lee-Enfield lineage. It was a respected system, but it carried the age and limitations of a platform that had been updated for a very long time. The point is not to mock old equipment. In defense, old can mean familiar, available, and supported by infrastructure that already exists. The problem begins when requirements change faster than the platform can keep pace. After the Falklands campaign, the need for a replacement became more urgent. The British government opened a competition. Manufacturers with industrial scale and international reputations entered it. Among them was Accuracy International. According to the company itself, it was founded in Portsmouth in 1980 by British competition shooters. A competition of this kind is not merely looking for greater accuracy on a specification sheet. It is trying to reduce uncertainty for an entire organization. The equipment must arrive in consistent batches, withstand transport and environmental conditions, work within an ecosystem of optics and documentation, and remain supported after the test team has dispersed. The L42A1 offered the benefit of familiarity, but it also represented a path of accumulated improvements. The competition created a rare opportunity to ask whether that lineage should be extended again or replaced by a different architecture. That detail changes how the episode should be read. The team did not begin by asking how to modernize an existing service rifle one more time. It came from an environment in which small variations in material, support, and consistency could change the result. Malcolm Cooper was the best-known figure, an elite athlete who would later win 2 Olympic gold medals. Alongside him were people with experience in design and manufacturing, including Dave Walls and David Kaig. The company was small, but its standard of quality was not. It had turned competition shooting's obsession with repeatability into a starting point. The submitted design became known as the PM, for Precision Marksman. Its central idea can be understood without any assembly instructions. In many earlier designs, accuracy depended on how critical components sat within a traditional structure and how much specialist work was required to achieve consistent results. Accuracy International's proposal treated the core of the system as a rigid spine and separated that structural role from the outer surfaces that gave the equipment its form. In industrial terms, the aim was to turn something close to craft quality into a repeatable property of the system. 2 examples should not require the same amount of individual adjustment merely to behave in a similar way. An army does not buy one impressive object. It buys hundreds or thousands of units, parts, training, inspection, and years of support. A solution that works only under the care of its creator may win a demonstration. A solution that keeps its characteristics after leaving the workshop has a chance of winning a contract. That distinction also explains why the structural core mattered more historically than many visible details. Outer surfaces can change with ergonomics, climate, or customer preference. The spine of the system must preserve fundamental relationships without turning every unit into a one-off piece. This is not a construction recipe, it is an architectural decision. The design moved part of its excellence away from the individual skill of a craftsperson and into a structure that a factory could repeat and an inspection process could verify. That was the logic that placed a small team against the giants. The competition was not judging a future legend. It was judging a concrete requirement. In 1985, the design was adopted by the United Kingdom as the L96A1. The image of the shed that beat the big firms is powerful because it reverses the expected hierarchy. But it also hides the risk. Winning a large contract can be more dangerous for a small company than losing one. Overnight, the organization must deliver volume, uniformity, and traceability that were never part of its previous routine. This is where the fairy tale nearly ended. Secondary accounts describe a serious quality control problem linked to the outsourced production of a component. The mechanical details are not needed here. What matters is the institutional consequence. A design can be correct on paper and still fail when specification, material, supplier, and inspection stop matching. The system's reputation was threatened not by a useless central idea, but by the distance between the designer's intention and execution at scale. That difference is one of the most important lessons in the story. Technology companies like to say that they have a good design. Armed forces need to know whether that design remains good after passing through contracts, batches, suppliers, and maintenance over many years. The crisis forced corrections and showed that Accuracy International had not yet mastered the category. It had created a promising proposition. Mastery would begin only when the company learned how to protect that proposition during manufacturing. There is a hidden organizational dimension here. Outsourcing does not remove responsibility, it redistributes it. Specifications must be understood, materials must be traceable, and deviations must return quickly to the designer and the buyer. When that chain fails, one small component can threaten confidence in the whole system. The near disaster is therefore not a side chapter. It is the test that separates invention from industrial capability. The company survived because the problem was recognized as a system problem rather than isolated bad luck. The next chapter came from Northern Europe. Sweden was seeking a system capable of remaining dependable in extreme cold. This was not a marketing requirement. Materials, lubrication, tolerances, and ergonomics can behave differently when temperatures fall sharply. The British response was to adapt the family to that environment without abandoning the architecture that already set it apart. According to Accuracy International's own official chronology, the Swedish PSG90 contract followed in 1991. The name Arctic Warfare came to define the design's evolution. The value of that chapter is not a list of altered parts. It is the method. The customer presented a difficult environment, the company responded by looking at the whole system. The basic structure remained recognizable, while materials and interfaces had to follow the new reality. That matters more than any superlative. The platform ceased to be merely the winner of a British competition and showed that it could be adapted to another doctrine, another climate, and another support chain. From there, the expansion became international. The company records the German G22 contract in 1995, alongside other adoptions over the years. Each country was not buying the same story. Requirements differed in range, environment, optics, transport, and institutional integration. The family grew because the core design allowed variation without erasing the identity of the whole. What began as an answer to replacing the L92A1 became a platform on which different customers could frame their own requirements. Here, platform does not mean that everything was interchangeable or that every customer received the same configuration. It means that fundamental decisions could support a recognizable family tree of solutions. That reduces the risk of starting from nothing, but it creates another challenge. Every new variant adds documentation, inventory, and support. International growth is an advantage only when the company can control that diversity. The history of the Arctic Warfare family is also the history of preserving technical identity without pretending that Sweden, Germany, and the United Kingdom had identical needs. That expansion also exposes the limits of the word rifle. For an institutional buyer, the isolated object is only one part of the problem. There is training, documentation, inspection, parts, updating, and assistance. A British procurement notice published decades later still treated Accuracy International as the holder of the knowledge required to support systems already in service. It shows how a design decision can create long-term dependencies. The winner does not deliver only metal. It delivers a technical relationship that can span generations of contracts. Over time, the family moved into later programs. The British Army describes the L115A3 as part of the Sniper System Improvement Program and states that the first batch was deployed to Afghanistan in 2008. Again, the important point is not to turn specifications into spectacle. The program brought together equipment, optics, and support to expand an institutional capability. It descended from the same philosophy that had defeated larger competitors in the 1980s: treat the result as a property of a complete system. In 2009, a British soldier used an L115A3 in an event that was cited for years as a combat distance record. The original source describes figures, corrections, and a sequence of shots. None of that is needed to understand the historical meaning, and none of it will be repeated here. The relevant fact is that a descendant of the platform stood at the center of a widely reported episode decades after the first contract. The other, more important fact is that the man involved later spoke publicly about the psychological cost he carried. When a technical narrative reduces that episode to distance and accuracy, it loses half the truth. Military systems are designed for a violent purpose, and people live with the consequences of that purpose. Recognizing this does not erase the engineering or turn the documentary into a sermon. It simply prevents a history of military procurement from using suffering as decoration. The evolution from the L96 to the L115A3 demonstrates industrial capability. The human experience shows that capability is not the same as glamour. Perhaps that is why the family's second life seems so strange. For millions of people, the first encounter with its silhouette did not happen in a museum, a regiment, or an official catalogue. It happened in games. Counter-Strike helped turn the designation AWP into part of popular vocabulary, even as variants were often confused. Other games and films repeated the shape until it became recognizable to people who could never explain the chronology from PM to L96, Arctic Warfare, and L115. That cultural fame does not prove that the system was the best. It proves that a simple visual form can condense a reputation. The long barrel, the overall profile, and the association with accuracy created a symbol. Popular culture simplified a history made of contracts, climate, suppliers, and revisions. In exchange, it gave the company something that institutional contracts rarely provide on their own: global recognition beyond its professional audience. That simplification had a curious effect. Many people learned an acronym before they knew the real object. Games mixed names and variants, and collective memory preserved a cleaner version than the chronology. For a documentary, this is both an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity is to begin with a familiar image. The risk is allowing fiction to become evidence. That is why culture enters after the industrial history, as a consequence of reputation rather than proof of performance. But the brand was not invulnerable. In 2005, the former company entered administrative receivership. The company that had beaten the large firms and spread its platform internationally nearly disappeared. Days later, a separate company was incorporated, and 4 directors were appointed. Corporate survival completes the argument almost perfectly. The design could be durable, but the company remained subject to finance, management, and market cycles. Good engineering does not suspend the rules of business. What existed after that crisis was no longer the small workshop of the beginning. It was an organization with contracts, intellectual property, accumulated knowledge, and a family recognized in several countries. At the same time, the memory of the shed remained useful because it explained the culture of origin: a small team from competition shooting confronting a problem that larger manufacturers seemed destined to solve. The story worked because the improbable part was true. It became misleading only when it erased the crisis that followed. So how, in the end, did Britain master the modern sniper rifle? Not because one model became perfect. Not because one distant shot settled the argument. And not because a national flag made the engineering superior. The mastery came from the sequence. First, a real requirement created room for something new. Then competition experience produced an architecture built around consistency. Adoption exposed weaknesses in manufacturing. Failure almost followed. Corrections came. A Scandinavian customer forced adaptation. Other contracts showed that the idea could cross borders. That chain is the true legacy of the L96 and the Arctic Warfare family. The design showed that modern military accuracy did not depend only on an exceptional craftsperson adjusting each example. It depended on a platform that could be manufactured, inspected, adapted, and supported as a system. Accuracy International's greatest victory was not defeating famous manufacturers in a competition. It was learning, after the victory, to behave like the company that the contract demanded. That difference matters because innovation and permanence are separate talents. A small team can see a solution that larger organizations overlook. Remaining requires processes, documentation, and the humility to correct what the first solution failed to predict. The L96 was born from the first talent. The Arctic Warfare family became durable only when the company developed the second. That is why the word unmatched deserves a question mark. The family had competitors, failures, risks, and limits. Even so, it changed expectations about how a specialized platform could be born, grow, and remain recognizable. The shed is the image that attracts attention. The mastery lies in what came after it, the discipline to turn a good idea into a durable institutional capability. If stories like this interest you, the next question is not which system wins in a catalog comparison. It is which design survives when reputation meets manufacturing, budgets, and doctrine. That is where the history of military technology truly begins.